All right, our next guest is Indy Johar. Indy is an architect and co-founder of 00 and the director of Dark Matter Labs. Indy, you have been working with many organizations all across the globe. Your work currently is focusing on systemic demonstrations of new realities, of actually bringing in a civic economy, looking at how new democracies can support a decision-making that is helping us not only to drive change on a local level, but also look into planetary scales. Your talk will be about infrastructuring tomorrow in an age of long emergencies, and we're looking forward to understanding a little bit better what that means.
Good morning, Caroline. I'm delighted to be here. So, well, I mean, I think what we're entering is two issues, and I think this is worth us recognizing. That I think on one hand, we're entering an age of peaks in our current resources, and our current resource frameworks, and our current technologies. We are reaching peaks of certain things, peaks of our energy system, peaks of our access to materials as a result of our energy system, peaks in terms of actually our current farming technologies and the risks, long-term risks of climate change. And these are, and perhaps even peaks of our current theory of human work. And actually that has peaked. And I think we're into a new age of human work. And what does that mean? When you put these things together, that's one aspect, the peak of that. But the really interesting first stage is the adjustment to volatility. Our industrial societies were built on a theory of predictability, built on largely a theory of near infiniteness of resource. Resource was not priced in. The actual cost of a barrel of oil was not priced in. What was priced in was the cost of extracting that oil. Now, as we move into the volatility that those limits are starting to impose as a result of climate change, with effectively, a volatile climate, volatile sort of weather systems as a result of that, means that actually what we're seeing is our cities are having to build pathways of resilience of handling that volatility. You're seeing one of the frames of that volatility be inflation. You're seeing, and that inflation is eating away at what I would say is the wage economy, as opposed to the wealth economy. And what that's starting to do is increase inequality, increase pressures, increase precarity. Now, that's one dimension of volatility. And another dimension, as you can know, was in 2008, when food prices went up something like 60% in terms of actually just onions and other things, basic food groups. We had riots in 60 cities around the world. So systemically, the volatility starts to hit there. Now, you couple that with energy, you couple that with the other things. I think the ability of our cities to be able to handle that volatility is going to be a big issue. Now, historically, that was never priced in. Resilience has never been priced in because actually the optimization of capital has driven short-term capital. It's not the optimization of capital and wealth long-term. Short-term capital has meant that we've built supply chains and logistics, which are all about efficiency and real-time price and real-time, just-in-time pricing. So that as the resilience value of a city becomes more and more systemically, societally valuable, how are we going to price that resilience in? Where do we price that resilience in becomes really critical. And that resilience isn't just in goods and materials. It's about how we as societies make decisions together. And this is under, our industrial mindset is also configured into our democracy and how we make decisions. And our capacity to make legitimate decisions as a civilization is really undermined and being questioned in a fundamental way. So I think that's where we are right now. And it opens up some, I think, critical questions for cities and places. And why cities? Because they're the point of these crises come to ground with a vast percentage of the world's population. That's where they manifest. They're the site of manifestation, the integral site of manifestation of both the challenge and perhaps the opportunity. And I think that's why cities become important.
I think what you've pointed out is understanding a little bit more this kind of age of long emergencies that you've mentioned and the volatility in that. So we have all of these peaks on the one hand, and the dynamics that are arising from these, let's say, peaks happening at the same time, and let's say cities as the points where many people come together, many people are living, working, but they need a different way of handling this volatility. You mentioned resilience as one approach to handle the shock, handle the change. And it would be interesting to understand a little bit better how can that resilience be priced in, or how can cities be changed or rebuilt to handle volatility better? Where are we coming from, and where are we possibly looking into or going towards?
I think that's a really, I think it's a question that goes to the heart of the matter, because when you try to price in volatility and you look at resilience, you have to take a total cost view of an issue. It's an entangled cost view. It cannot be the resilience of one part of the system, because if another part of the system breaks, actually the whole thing goes down. So you might say the resilience of the traders, well, that might be maximizing pricing in one sense. You say the resilience of some sections of society, that might be just some sections. So when you talk about, or even the food that you buy, which produces bad health, that's a cost to society as a whole. That's a loss of opportunity for society as a whole. So when you start to take a total cost view of this issue, it asks much more fundamental questions about our economic theory, which has really been based on transactional value between partners. It's based on the theory of two partners coming to an agreement, and the externalities are largely ignored. In a resilient sense, you can't ignore the externalities. You can't ignore the risk. They have to be priced into the system. And I think this is where it's starting to ask some really hard questions about how we optimize our systems and how our systems are designed to self-optimize. And when you start taking a total cost view, then you have to ask the question, all assets are entangled. There is no discrete asset. Ownership is insufficient for stewardship in entanglement, because actually ownership is too discrete and individualistic, whereas actually stewardship requires much broader and multi-stakeholder views on assets, because they have consequential effects. So this starts to ask, and the entanglement also forces, I think, another layer of thinking, which is to have to start to look at landscape level effects. So you start to have to think at the infrastructure value or the aggregate value at a population level, not just the discrete object value. Now that itself opens up some really structural governance questions. Who thinks about this stuff at the landscape level? Where does the legitimacy come from? How is it priced fairly? How is it governed? And I think that stuff, and these sort of things are going to, and every landscape for different materials, different aspects will be different. So this isn't a single monolithic landscape, it's multi-landscape systems which have to interact well. And when you start to think like that, that asks even more fundamental questions. Where do you construct these landscape orchestration instruments? Who constructs them? How do they orchestrate? How do they value? Is this the role of cities? Is this the role of new common asset trusts which work with cities? And how do we orchestrate them? And I think these are going to be some fundamental questions. And the reason for cities or not cities in this, by the way, just to be precise, is that the biggest issue is not centralized, is not public or private, I would argue, because public and private are entangled fundamentally. It's about proximity and abstraction. Who is close to the problem, who is abstracted from the problem. And the proximity is the fundamental issue in complex systems. And abstraction actually is where the challenges are. So the problems are more with abstracted capital versus proximus capital. So how do we orchestrate that is going to be really critical. Sorry.
I have two immediate examples, or three, that are coming to my mind. So Berlin, and also celebrating the Summerfest of City Lab. We will hear later on from Leona Lynn, who is part of a project called House of the Statistic, that is a public-civil partnership here in Berlin, where basically civil society organization is going into taking care of public civic assets across the city. This is now one house, which is not only a house, but a whole area close to Alexanderplatz in the middle of town. And if you talk about infrastructures, how can a governance structure like that be actually expanded across like a larger scale stewardship approach? And on the other hand, we have a project that is very well known in Berlin. It's called Gieß den Kiez, where basically City Lab has been developing an application where citizens can take care of trees. They can take stewardship for trees and actually see which trees still need watered in the summer or not. I know that you have been developing a project called Trees AI, which looks at a different financing model and bringing that together. How can we actually maybe take these two examples as something that can describe a little bit more concretely about the larger scale vision that you just pointed out?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right to point out these two possibilities. And I think these two possibilities are great. So they articulate what I think is really important, is when you talk about landscape level things, you have to talk about hybrid capital firstly. Not everything needs to be monetized, and not everything needs to be organized through transactions. It needs to be organized through care. How do we build other forms of interaction points into systems? Because the big danger of creating new agglomerations is you make them monolithic in terms of their power and orchestration. So I think one of the things that digital capabilities are starting to build us is the capabilities to build hybrid capital models at the landscape level. And this is really important because I think without the hybridity, I think we return back to some form of stakeholderism. So I think that's a really key point. What the City Lab is doing again with the trees is really important because it builds those hybrid capital. So the idea of care is a key part of the landscape level effect. Now, I also think the House of Studies, public civic partnerships, these are going to be really critical components of it, because I think we have to get to the proximity of the data, the proximity of the effects, the proximity of actually the wildlife you can hear in the background in that framework. So I think, so these are two components. I think what's also happening is that I think there's a third dimension, which is our capacity and technology is opening up mechanisms to organize in fundamentally different ways. And I think that's also going to be a key component. So can we create we've seen rivers being made self-sovereign. We've seen forests being made self-sovereign. How do we start to create programmable autonomy of micro-civic things which interact through co-beneficiary effects? So how does, we're doing this project called the Free House, where how does a house own itself? So it isn't owned for equity. It isn't owned for making residual value. It still can be financed, but it's actually owned for civic benefit terms. And public housing has done some of those roles historically, but I think what's becomes interesting is the micro locational value of these things. So how is a house optimized for its particular context, as opposed to the context of a whole city or a whole region? So there's a different type of way of thinking about this stuff, which also becomes really important. So I think these things are fractaling down at every level, as you say.
And something else is coming to my mind. We have another project in Berlin. It's called Flussbad. It's basically an initiative that is trying to create access to the river Spree, which is our big city river, and make it swimmable. But it's very, very difficult to even build a staircase towards the river. And the prognosis right now is that it will take about 8 to 10 years to build this staircase because of legal obligations. So the riverbed is actually something that is legally bound to the federal level. The water of the river is legally bound to the state. And the actual access is what the city is taking care of. So in terms of looking at the regulatory system to these kind of larger scale infrastructures, what is your idea, or how can we actually manage these kind of interactions between different legal levels to come down not only to internalizing the costs into what we have to build, but also have a kind of legal framework that is helping us to take the right decisions, but also in the speed that is necessary.
And I think this is a really important problem, because in a way these problems are defining how our common goods have been governed and fractured in many different ways. So how do we start to think about, say, common asset trusts? How would the river spree be actually organized as a common asset? Would you need to actually talk about building it as a right to water? Would you give it a political right first and then force the right into being able to buy access? So it's a really interesting tactical positional view. I was in Zurich recently, and if you want to know what's possible, and many of you will, Copenhagen has done something similar, it's extraordinary to go to Zurich and see the quality of the water and the quality of the experience and what effect it has. So I think part of it is also understanding the value of this thing, that this isn't just a right, it's massively valuable in terms of actually the sociability, the civic care it creates, and how do you take an integral response to not only the federal use of the river Spree or the regional use of the river Spee in terms of its water and its sort of, but also its civic use. And then what you've seen is the federal and the regional become more dominant than actually the local civic value. And that, I think, is also, it's a relational value has been undermined. So I think the kind of pathways of building common asset trusts, I think, are going to be really critical, where multiple stakeholders can actually negotiate around this stuff. But more importantly, how do you build the integrity not only of these three different perspectives? What's the biological perspective? What's the future temporal perspective? There are other perspectives that are currently missing from these negotiations. And how do you force them to be integral positions as opposed to just separate positions? And I think that's a key part of that story. How do these positions have to combine, have to build mutual responsibility, but not just for these, but multiple other positions around it. And I think that's where I think when you talk about a river becoming self-sovereign, it changes the point of view. It doesn't take the federal view on the river, it takes the river's view upwards to everyone else it benefits, which kind of pivots the point of view, which I think is very powerful.
So maybe a little bit to conclude, infrastructuring tomorrow means that we're taking a different point of view when, how shall I say, sketching or also planning and negotiating these kind of very local decisions. But it also means that we actually have to build new skills within our institutions and within our societal, let's say, initiatives to actually be able to take that point of view. And maybe we can round up with a little bit looking into the skill level and understanding better what has to be built on a human scale. And as you know, we have been working and are still working on a digital strategy for Berlin. And it's not only a digital strategy, but a strategy to embed the digital in a kind of city mode of the future, and also understanding how to have a bridge between the analog, the digital, the civic, and the institutional level. So looking at that, how you would say, entanglement or that kind of interdependence, how can we actually not only digitize the kind of thinking or the mindsets of the past where we're coming from, but also explore or experiment with some concepts that you've just mentioned by pricing in resilience, taking a kind of look or self-sovereign point of view of things around us that we have maybe objectified in the past, and maybe also taking into account future generations that represent, people, but also ecology that we haven't taken into account in the decision making so far. Are there any ideas what kind of skills and what kind of modes would help us to actually build that into a city interaction, a city decision-making process?
Definitely. There's a few things that you've just mentioned, many of them, but there's a few things that I would like to mention. So when we talk about infrastructure, we need to expand the notion of beyond roads and rails, which we've done in this conversation. And I think that, and why that's important is because of the entanglement that we talked about. So just to reinforce that point. So we should be talking about a tree canopy of a city as being infrastructure, the mental health of a city being the output infrastructure of multiple other investments. So how do you build the intangible infrastructures of a city, the decision-making capacity of a city, not just a council? That's a form of infrastructure, right? So one, expanding. Two, if we really look at actually sort of the sensor infrastructure of a city is actually really critical, like you say. Now, these are all examples. Now, when we get into the next part of this story, which is effectively how do we, what capabilities are required, we can start to see that the most fundamental capability shift is you have to move. If we're going to move to this theory of infrastructure being self-sovereign in some sense and being multi-stakeholder as a result of it, so being generous in its system, you have to move from a theory of control to a theory of learning. So our theories of organizing were based around control orientation. You know, the role of the public is to control and maintain infrastructure. Whereas actually what we need to build is learning infrastructures and the developmental infrastructures, because I think these are organic, multi-perspectival systems. So how do you build the learning capacity in our state, in our theories of governance capabilities, I think is one of the most fundamental things. And that learning capacity is not just at the individual level, it's at the policy level. What is a learning policy? How does a policy learn, evolve once it's been kind of approved? So I think there's a whole class of capability around the learning side, which I think is really critical. And then how do you build legitimacy in that learning in an open, declarative way? So it's not just your learning, the learning of the system as a whole. So I think learning for me is one. And then there's other forms like simple things or not so simple things, which is like, how do you do multi-actor procurement? How do you get 15 different parts of government to co-procure the benefits of a river? That's not just, can't be the environmental agency that does it. It has to be a coordinated effect because the value is coordinated. And no single department has all the power, all the money, resources to do it. So multi-actor procurement and multi-actor orchestration becomes really fundamental to making these integral points of view happen. And that is not just within cities, but also vertically to federal. So without that coordination of how we allocate, you can't build integral investments with integral value points at the other side. So these are examples of capabilities that become really critical in terms of actually functioning and operating, giving value.
So what you're saying is, on the one hand, the skill learning to learn, maybe also learning to unlearn on the institutional level, and a different type of culture to go into a mode that is actually allowing us, how shall I say, to explore forward together. I think in Berlin, one thing that is happening right now, the strategy that we're building is a learning strategy, and it has cycles of evaluation built into it, but it's also something that is actually leading to a different way of organizing around it. And I think there we might even have to be more strict in documenting the type of learning that is happening, so we can actually go back to understand and reflect what is happening on the way, while one is busy, trying to juggle 5 balls at the same time. So maybe looking at your own work to check out for right now, what are you learning right now, and looking at the work that you are doing, what's your next way of exploring something or looking ahead?
I think, from our side, what we're very focused on is building these symbolic, entangled positions or assets. I hate the word assets because it's again an old world view. But how do we manifest these things in a real way? So whether it's a camera that owns itself, or a sensor that owns itself, to the house that owns itself, to a tree canopy, to the mental health. So what we've been looking at is these symbolic moments where these realities converge, and then really looking at how do you build that contractual governance finance layer around them? Because in a way, that dark matter is the thing that we need to reinvent in order for us to move from a control thesis to effectively a new thesis of these assets, being the point of view being from these assets outwards for public good in recognition of their entanglement. So for us, that's been the really real case, and where the way our theory of change is that you build one, you allow people to experience a new way of being in, say, a house, which is self-owning, where you have a relationship of care, not a relationship of consumption or relationship of ownership. And that experience, as well as effectively the open sourcing of the contractual legal financing framework, actually is where we create large-scale replicability and large-scale change. And I think that's really how our contribution to this debate, which I think is, like you say, happening in many places.
Thank you very much. And
absolute pleasure.
We're looking forward to your demonstrations and the work that you're doing to maybe also experience some of that in Berlin.
Be an absolute delight. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Bye.